The Sunday morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Miami's Hope Community Church, casting colorful shadows across Pastor John Matthews' face as he delivered his weekly sermon. His deep voice carried through the packed church, speaking about trust and family values while his wife Diane sat in the front row, smiling up at him with pride. No one in the congregation could have guessed that this seemingly perfect scene would shatter into pieces within weeks. John had mastered the art of appearance over his 15 years leading the church. Every gesture, every word was calculated to project the image of a devoted husband and spiritual leader. His silver-streaked black hair was always neatly combed, his suits pressed to perfection, and his smile practiced until it seemed completely natural. The congregation loved how he'd stop to chat after services, remembering everyone's names and asking about their families with what appeared to be genuine interest. Diane, with her warm brown eyes and gentle demeanor, played her part as the perfect pastor's wife. She ran the women's ministry, organized church events, and hosted Bible study groups in their modest but well-kept home. People often told her how lucky she was to have such a dedicated husband. She'd smile and agree, pushing down the nagging doubts that had started creeping in over the past few months. The changes had been subtle at first. John's conferences became more frequent, his phone calls more private. He'd step outside to take them, claiming they were sensitive pastoral matters. Diane noticed how he'd changed the password on his phone, something he'd never done in their 20 years of marriage. Small things, really, but they added up like grains of sand until they became impossible to ignore. That fateful Tuesday evening started like any other. Diane was tidying their bedroom, putting away the laundry she'd finished folding. John was downstairs in his study, preparing for Wednesday night's Bible study. As she tucked his shirts into the drawer, her hand brushed against something papery tucked in the corner. Curious, she pulled out a crumpled receipt from the Palmetto Hotel, dated 2 weeks ago. The discovery might have meant nothing if the dates hadn't coincided exactly with John's supposed conference in Tampa. The receipt showed a booking for 2 nights, but the hotel wasn't in Tampa. It was just 30 minutes away in Orlando. Diane's hands trembled as she smoothed out the paper, her mind racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. She told herself not to jump to conclusions. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the Tampa conference had been moved at the last minute. Maybe he'd stopped there on his way back. But something inside her, a voice she'd been trying to silence for months, whispered that she needed to look deeper. Standing on shaky legs, Diane moved to their closet. John always kept his old receipts and documents in a shoebox on the top shelf, claiming he needed them for tax purposes. She'd never had reason to look through them before. Now, pulling down the box, she felt like she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. The box was a Pandora's chest of secrets. More hotel receipts, all from Orlando. Restaurant bills for 2. A phone bill showing repeated calls to a number she didn't recognize. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper as if to protect it, a small photo album. Diane's heart pounded as she opened it. The first photo showed a woman, probably in her mid-30s, with long blonde hair and a bright smile. She was beautiful in a way that made Diane suddenly aware of her own graying hair and laugh lines. But it was the next photo that made her sink to the floor, her legs no longer able to hold her up. The woman again, but this time she wasn't alone. She stood between 2 children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 7. They were all wearing Christmas sweaters, posed in front of a decorated tree. John's arm was wrapped around the woman's waist, and his smile. Diane had never seen him smile quite like that at church. Time seemed to stop as she stared at the photo, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The boy had John's nose. The girl had his eyes. These weren't just random people, this was another family. His other family. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped her back to reality. Diane quickly shoved everything back into the box, except for the hotel receipt that had started it all. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The weight of 20 years of marriage pressed down on her chest as she heard John's familiar tread in the hallway. "Honey." His voice carried through the door. "Everything okay up here? You've been awful quiet." Diane looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the pale, shaken woman who stared back. She gripped the receipt tightly in her hand, took a deep breath, and turned to face the door. The moment of truth had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. "John," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk." He pushed the door open, still wearing his reading glasses and holding a Bible study outline. His familiar smile faltered slightly when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" Diane held up the receipt, watching as recognition flickered across his features. "Want to explain why you were at the Palmetto Hotel in Orlando when you were supposed to be at a conference in Tampa?" For a split second, something dark crossed John's face, something Diane had never seen before. Then it was gone, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. "Oh, that? The Tampa conference got moved at the last minute. I must have forgotten to mention it." "Don't lie to me." Diane's voice cracked. "I found the others too. And the photos." The change in John was immediate and terrifying. His whole body seemed to tense, like a coiled spring. "You went through my things?" The warmth in his voice disappeared, replaced by something cold and hard. "How long?" Diane demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "How long have you been living this double life? Those children, they're yours, aren't they?" John took a step forward, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You had no right to go through my personal belongings." "I had no right?" Diane's voice rose. "I'm your wife." 20 years, John. 20 years we've been married, and all this time. "You don't understand," he cut her off. "It's complicated. Then explain it to me." She was shouting now, years of suppressed doubts and fears bursting forth. "Explain how my husband, a pastor, could live such a lie. What about your vows? What about everything you preach every Sunday about faithfulness and honesty?" "Keep your voice down," John hissed, glancing nervously at the window. "The neighbors will hear." "Let them hear. Let everyone hear what kind of man their beloved pastor really is." She turned toward the door, but John moved faster than she'd ever seen him move. His hand clamped around her arm, spinning her back around. "You're not going anywhere." "Let go of me." Diane tried to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. "Listen to me," he growled, his face inches from hers. "You have no idea what you're about to destroy. I've spent years building this life, both of my lives. I won't let you ruin everything." "Both of your lives?" Diane laughed bitterly. "What about my life, John? What about the life you stole from me with your lies?" She managed to wrench her arm free and stumbled backward, bumping into their dresser. Family photos crashed to the floor, their wedding day, church picnics, mission trips. 20 years of memories, all built on deception. "I'm calling Linda," Diane said, reaching for her phone. "And then I'm going to tell the church board everything." "No, you're not." John's voice was deadly calm now. He moved toward her with purpose, his face set in a mask she didn't recognize. This wasn't the man who'd held her hand through her mother's funeral or who prayed with troubled parishioners. This was a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Stay back," Diane warned, but her voice trembled. She backed away until she hit the wall, her phone clutched to her chest like a shield. John reached for her, his hands outstretched. "Give me the phone, Diane. We can talk about this rationally. Find a way to work things out." "Work things out?" She stared at him in disbelief. "You have another family, children. How exactly do we work that out?" His hands found her throat before she could scream. The phone clattered to the floor as Diane clawed at his fingers, struggling to breathe. Her vision started to blur, and the last thing she saw was her husband's face, the face she'd woken up to for 20 years, watching impassively as the life drained from her body. Later that night, a police officer would step out of his patrol car at a routine checkpoint, puzzled by a dark stain seeping from the trunk of a well-maintained sedan. The driver, a respected local pastor, would smile nervously and refuse to open it. But the truth, like the blood dripping onto the asphalt, couldn't be contained anymore. John Matthews' carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, and the ripples would spread far beyond the quiet Miami suburb he'd called home. The story of John Matthews and his devastating double life spread across social media like wildfire. Local news comment sections filled with heated discussions as people struggled to process how someone so trusted could harbor such dark secrets. Many found themselves examining their own relationships, wondering what shadows might lurk beneath familiar surfaces. Sarah Chun, a regular at Hope Community Church, spent hours scrolling through the comments on news articles about the case. "I let this man baptize my daughter," she wrote. "He counseled my husband and me through our marriage problems. How do you trust anyone after something like this?" Her comments sparked a flood of responses. Some shared similar experiences of betrayal, while others defended the importance of maintaining faith in people despite individual failures. The conversation shifted from John's specific crime to broader questions about trust, deception, and the masks people wear. Local coffee shops buzzed with discussions about warning signs people might have missed. Regular church members recalled moments that seemed innocent at the time, but now carried darker implications. The way John always kept his phone face down during meetings. How he'd check his watch during counseling sessions that ran close to certain times. The occasional slip-ups in his stories about where he'd been. Mental health professionals joined the conversation, offering insights into the psychology of living a double life. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a relationship counselor, found herself fielding countless questions from worried couples. "The Matthews case triggers our deepest fears about intimacy and trust," she explained during a community forum. "We're all wondering, how well do we really know the people we love?" Social media platforms filled with relationship challenge hashtags. People shared stories of how they discovered their partner's secrets, ranging from hidden gambling debts to secret social media accounts. Each story seemed to echo aspects of John and Diane's tragedy, though few reached such devastating conclusions. Marriage counselors reported a surge in appointments as couples, rattled by the Matthews case, sought to address their own trust issues. Some discovered their fears were unfounded, leading to stronger relationships. Others uncovered painful truths that had been festering beneath the surface. The case became a turning point for many in discussing the nature of trust and betrayal in the digital age. How easy technology made it to lead parallel lives, and how difficult it made keeping secrets forever. Every deleted text message, every password change, every unexplained absence took on new significance in light of John's exposure. Local support groups formed, both online and in person, for people processing the trauma of betrayal. Former members of Hope Community Church gathered to share their feelings of guilt and anger. Many wondered if they could have somehow prevented Diane's death if they'd noticed something sooner, asked more questions, or looked more closely at the man they'd trusted with their spiritual guidance. The conversation spread beyond Miami, touching people who'd never set foot in Hope Community Church. Something about John's double life resonated with a deeper anxiety in modern society. In an era of carefully curated social media presence, where everyone showed their best face to the world, how could anyone be sure what lay beneath the surface? Reddit threads dissected every detail of the case that became public. Amateur sleuths traced John's movements through years of social media posts, finding photos where his wedding ring mysteriously disappeared and reappeared. Others shared their own experiences of uncovering their partner's secrets, offering advice and support to those still dealing with the aftermath of betrayal. Relationship experts began using the Matthews case as a conversation starter in couples therapy sessions. "What would you do if you found evidence your partner was living another life?" became a starting point for discussions about trust, communication, and boundaries. The answers revealed as much about the respondents as they did about their relationships. Paula Martinez, a domestic violence counselor, used the case to highlight the importance of having an escape plan. Diane's tragic end shows us why confronting a suspected cheater alone can be dangerous, she wrote in a viral blog post. "Always have support systems in place. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." The case sparked debates about privacy in relationships. Where was the line between trust and verification? Some argued that checking a partner's phone or email was itself a breach of trust. Others countered that blind faith could be dangerous, citing Diane's years of unquestioning acceptance as a cautionary tale. Relationship coaches saw their social media following surge as they offered advice on detecting deception and building genuine trust. Videos about signs your partner is living a double life racked up millions of views. Comment sections filled with stories from people who discovered their own partner's secrets after the Matthews case prompted them to look more closely. The conversation evolved beyond simple questions of infidelity to explore deeper issues of identity and authenticity. People shared stories of discovering their partner's hidden addictions, secret debts, or concealed past lives. Each revelation seemed to underscore how well people could hide their true selves from those closest to them. Support groups for betrayed spouses saw their membership numbers spike. Many reported that the Matthews case had given them the courage to face their own suspicions rather than living in denial. Others found themselves dealing with renewed trauma as the story brought back memories of their own experiences with deception. As the weeks passed, the conversation shifted from shock and horror to reflection and prevention. People shared strategies for building honest relationships and maintaining open communication. The tragedy became a catalyst for difficult but necessary discussions about trust, truth, and the consequences of living a lie. The case served as a dark reminder that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from those we trust most completely. But it also sparked a movement toward greater honesty in relationships, as people realized that the temporary pain of truth was preferable to the potential consequences of living with lies. News of Diane Matthews' murder hit the Hope Community Church congregation like a tidal wave. The church parking lot, usually empty on Monday mornings, filled with stunned parishioners gathering to process the unthinkable. Some stood in small groups, wiping tears and sharing hugs. Others sat alone in their cars, staring blankly at the building where they'd watched John preach just yesterday. Detective Maria Suarez pulled up to the Matthews house at dawn, red and blue lights reflecting off the well-maintained garden Diane had tended so carefully. The front door stood partially open, something obviously wrong in this quiet neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked at night. Inside, the home told a story of violence that contradicted its peaceful exterior. The living room showed no signs of struggle, but upstairs was a different matter. The master bedroom looked like a storm had torn through it. A lamp lay shattered on the carpet, family photos scattered across the floor, their frames cracked and broken. Blood spattered the beige wall near the dresser, and Diane's reading glasses lay crushed near the doorway. "Looks like she put up one hell of a fight," Officer Rodriguez remarked, photographing a clump of gray hair caught in a jewelry box corner. DNA would later confirm it was John's, evidence of Diane's desperate struggle for survival. The investigation team worked methodically, documenting every detail. They found Diane's phone under the bed, its screen cracked but still functioning. The last attempted call was to her sister Linda, cut off before it could connect. In the closet, they discovered the box of receipts, though the photo album was missing. John had apparently grabbed it in his panic, leaving behind a trail of paper that would help piece together his double life. The bedroom's disorder told a clear story to the experienced investigators. The violence had escalated quickly, moving from the area near the dresser toward the bed. Blood patterns suggested Diane had been backed into a corner before the final confrontation. Detective Suarez photographed distinctive marks on the wall where someone had been slammed against it repeatedly. The neighbors heard arguing, Rodriguez reported, flipping through his notes. But they said that wasn't unusual lately. Thought it was just stress from church work. The church secretary arrived while the crime scene unit was still processing the house. She stood trembling on the front lawn, clutching a stack of papers. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered to Detective Suarez. "The withdrawals from the church accounts. I knew something wasn't right, but Pastor John always had an explanation." Financial records would soon reveal a pattern of suspicious transfers stretching back years. Small amounts at first, growing bolder over time. Money moved through a series of accounts before landing in Orlando, funding a life the congregation never knew existed. The church office yielded more clues. John's computer contained carefully deleted emails to a realtor in Orlando, discussing property viewings from 6 years ago. His calendar showed regular gaps every third week, times he'd marked as spiritual retreat, but actually spent with his other family. By afternoon, news vans lined the street. Reporters gathered outside the police tape, their cameras focused on the front door as investigators carried out evidence bags. Neighbors stood in their driveways, sharing snippets of information and speculation. None of them could believe that John, their John, who'd prayed with them and counseled their children, could be capable of such violence. The investigation shifted to John's movements on the night of the murder. Traffic cameras caught his car heading east at 9:47 p.m., away from the direction he'd later be caught. He'd driven aimlessly for hours, probably trying to figure out what to do with Diane's body. The trunk camera at the checkpoint showed him pull ING up at 2:13 a.m., his usual confident smile replaced by barely controlled panic. Officer Jenny Martinez, who'd made the traffic stop, couldn't shake the memory of John's face when she'd asked to check his trunk. He kept saying he was late for a hospital visit, that one of his parishioners was dying, she recalled. But his hands were shaking when he gripped the steering wheel. Something felt off. The evidence from the trunk painted a grim picture. Diane's body had been wrapped in a painting drop cloth from the garage, but she'd fought so hard earlier that blood had already soaked through. The medical examiner would later determine that the cause of death was strangulation, though she'd suffered multiple other injuries during the struggle. John's escape route became clear as detectives traced his cell phone activity. He'd headed first toward Tampa, his usual alibi location, before doubling back toward Orlando. They suspected he'd planned to dispose of Diane's body in one of the remote areas along his regular route between his two lives. The investigation team set up in the church basement, transforming the children's Sunday school room into a command center. The walls, usually decorated with bright Bible story posters, now held timeline charts and crime scene photos. Detective Suarez couldn't help but notice the irony of planning their case beneath a mural of Noah's Ark. Church members came forward one by one to give statements. They painted a picture of recent changes in both John and Diane. She'd become quieter in the past few months, dropping out of her usual activities. He'd grown short-tempered, snapping at small problems he would have laughed off before. Everyone had assumed it was just the stress of running a growing congregation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A teenage boy from the youth group approached the police, nervous but determined. He'd been helping clean the church security cameras and had saved some footage that struck him as strange. The video showed John in his office late one night, carefully going through what looked like two separate phones, moving information between them. The whole time we were investigating him for embezzlement last month, he was already planning this, the church treasurer realized, watching John's practice movements on the security footage. He knew we were close to discovering the missing funds. When Diane found out about his other family, it all started falling apart. As day turned to evening, Detective Suarez stood in the Matthews driveway, watching the crime scene unit pack up their equipment. A small shrine had appeared by the mailbox, flowers, cards, and candles left by neighbors and church members. Among them sat a framed photo of Diane from last year's church directory, her smile bright and trusting. The hardest part to understand, Suarez said to her partner, is how long he maintained this facade. All those sermons about honesty and fidelity while he was living this completely different life just an hour away. But as they would soon discover, the depth of John's deception went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The investigation was about to uncover a web of lies so intricate that even veteran detectives would be shocked by its complexity. And in Orlando, a woman named Melissa was about to receive a visit that would shatter her world just as completely as John had destroyed Diane's. Linda Reynolds hadn't slept properly since getting the call about her sister's murder. She sat in Diane's kitchen, surrounded by family photos and half-finished projects that would never be completed. A grocery list in Diane's handwriting still hung on the fridge: eggs, milk, coffee, ordinary items that now felt like precious artifacts. She tried to call me that night, Linda told Detective Suarez, running her fingers over Diane's favorite coffee mug. If I'd only answered. Her voice cracked, and she took a moment to compose herself. But that's what he wanted, isn't it? For her to feel alone. The detective watched Linda carefully handle a stack of Diane's journals, recently discovered in a hidden compartment of her bedside table. Diane was smart, Linda explained. She knew something was wrong, but she was gathering evidence before confronting him. That was just like her, methodical, careful. The journals revealed months of growing suspicion. Diane had noted down times, dates, discrepancies in John's stories. She'd even started taking photos of the mileage on his car, comparing it to the distances he claimed to travel for his conferences. The entries became increasingly worried in tone, though she'd clearly struggled with whether to trust her instincts. April 15th, Linda read aloud, her voice shaking. John said he was in Tampa again. Called the hotel he usually stays at, just to check. They've never heard of him. Am I losing my mind? Maybe there's another hotel. Maybe I'm being paranoid. But why does he get so angry when I ask questions? Working with the police, Linda helped piece together a timeline of John's movements over the past 6 years. She remembered family events he'd missed, excuses that seemed reasonable at the time, but now formed a pattern. Every third weekend. Every other holiday. Always with a plausible story about pastoral duties or conferences. The church secretary provided years of credit card statements and travel reimbursement forms. Linda and Detective Suarez spread them across the dining room table where Diane used to host Sunday dinners. Together, they traced the growth of John's deception from occasional lies to an elaborate double life. Look at this. Linda pointed to a series of charges. He claimed these were for marriage counseling conferences, but they're all from jewelry stores in Orlando. Christmas gifts for his other family, while Diane was here thinking he was helping other couples save their marriages. Church members started coming forward with their own pieces of the puzzle. A deacon remembered John taking suspicious phone calls during board meetings. The youth pastor recalled times when John's stories about where he'd been didn't quite match what he'd told others. Small inconsistencies that seemed meaningless on their own formed a damning pattern when viewed together. Linda threw herself into the investigation, channeling her grief into action. She coordinated with victims' advocacy groups, worked with the prosecutors, and began speaking to domestic violence organizations. Diane's voice was silenced, she told reporters. But I won't be quiet. This story needs to be told. Meanwhile, in Orlando, Melissa Parker's world was collapsing in a different way. She sat in her living room, staring at the detective's badge on her coffee table, trying to process the impossible news they'd just delivered. Her husband, or the man she thought was her husband, was in jail for murdering his other wife. He told me he was a widower, she whispered, looking at photos of her children. Said his wife died of cancer before we met. The kids, they loved him so much. How do I tell them? Her hands trembled as she handed over bank statements, photos, birthday cards, evidence of a life she now knew was built on lies. The investigators were gentle but thorough. They needed to understand the full scope of John's deception. Melissa's version of him was different from the pastor in Miami. Here, he was Jack Matthews, a business consultant who traveled frequently for work. He'd explained his regular absences as client meetings, his time with his Miami congregation disguised as business trips. The worst part, Melissa confided to Detective Suarez, is that he was a wonderful father when he was here. Never missed a soccer game or dance recital when he was in town. How could someone fake that kind of love? Her financial records told another story of John's duplicity. The money he'd stolen from the church in Miami had helped maintain his Orlando life. Melissa had thought his consulting business was successful, never questioning the source of their comfortable lifestyle. Now she faced losing her home, her savings tainted by his crimes. Linda and Melissa met for the first time at the prosecutor's office. Two women who'd never known about each other, both victims of the same man's lies. Their conversation was awkward at first, each seeing in the other a reflection of their own pain. I don't blame you, Linda said finally, breaking a tense silence. He fooled us all. Melissa nodded, tears in her eyes. Your sister? I wish I'd known. Maybe I could have. We all wish we'd known, Linda cut in. But the only person responsible for Diane's death is John. Together, they began sharing information. Melissa's photos and records helped fill gaps in the timeline. Linda's knowledge of John's church life explained absences Melissa had never questioned. Their combined evidence painted a picture of a man who had spent years carefully constructing and maintaining two separate lives. The children were the hardest part. Melissa's kids couldn't understand why their father wasn't coming home. The older boy, David, became angry and withdrawn. 10-year-old Sarah kept asking when Daddy would come back from his business trip. Melissa struggled to explain the inexplicable, to help them understand that the father they loved had never really existed. The case grew stronger as more evidence emerged. Both women provided investigators with text messages, emails, and photos. They discovered John had used elaborate systems to keep his two lives separate. Different phones, different email accounts, even different clothes he'd keep in his car to maintain each identity. Bank records revealed the complex financial web he'd woven. Money moved between accounts, carefully disguised as business transactions or church expenses. He'd stolen from both families, building a reserve fund they suspected he'd planned to use if his deception was ever discovered. As the investigation deepened, Linda and Melissa formed an unlikely alliance. They shared not just evidence, but also their grief, anger, and gradual steps toward healing. Together, they began working on a foundation to help other families affected by similar deceptions, determined to create something positive from their shared tragedy. The interrogation room at Miami-Dade Police Department was deliberately uncomfortable, too cold, chairs slightly too hard, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. John Matthews sat perfectly still, his pastor's collar still neat despite spending the night in holding. Detective Suarez watched him through the one-way glass, noting how he maintained his practiced, calm expression. "He hasn't asked for a lawyer yet," Officer Rodriguez mentioned, passing her a coffee. "Been sitting there quoting Bible verses to himself for the last hour." Suarez had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her 15-year career, but something about John's composure unsettled her. Most people, guilty or innocent, showed some signs of stress after being caught with their dead wife in their trunk. John looked like he was waiting for a routine church meeting. When she entered the room, he smiled, the same warm, trustworthy smile that had convinced countless parishioners to confide their secrets in him. "Detective," he said smoothly, "I hope we can clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding quickly. I have a funeral to perform this afternoon." "A funeral?" Suarez kept her voice neutral as she sat down. "Not your wife's, I hope. The medical examiner hasn't released her body yet." She opened her folder, spreading crime scene photos across the table. "Want to tell me about these, Pastor?" John barely glanced at the photos. "I've already explained. I found Diane like that. She must have fallen, hit her head. I panicked, made a mistake in not calling the police immediately. But I was on my way to the hospital when your officer stopped me." "Funny kind of fall," Suarez remarked, sliding forward a photo of the bruises on Diane's neck. "Never seen someone fall and accidentally strangle themselves. Or stuff themselves into a car trunk." For just a moment, something flickered behind John's eyes, a flash of the rage that had killed Diane. Then it was gone, replaced by concerned confusion. "I understand how it looks, Detective, but you don't know the whole story." "Then tell me." Suarez leaned back, giving him space to talk. "Tell me about Melissa, about David and Sarah, about the house in Orlando you've been paying for with church funds." The change was subtle but immediate. John's left hand twitched slightly, and a thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. His eyes darted to the door, calculating, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Suarez began laying out evidence methodically. Hotel receipts, bank statements, phone records showing calls to Orlando at all hours. With each new piece, she watched the facade crack just a little more. John's hands, folded calmly on the table, began to tighten until his knuckles turned white. "You maintained two completely separate lives for 6 years," she continued. "That takes dedication. Planning. A real talent for lying. Must have been exhausting, keeping all those stories straight. Never mixing up which life you were living at any given moment." "You don't understand," John interrupted, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in sermons. "Everything I did for my families. Both of them needed me. I provided for them, protected them, loved them dash. Loved them?" Suarez cut in sharply. "Is that what you call what you did to Diane? When you wrapped your hands around her throat because she discovered your lies?" The calm mask finally slipped. John's face contorted with anger as he slammed his hands on the table. She was going to ruin everything. 20 years of building something meaningful, and she was ready to tear it all down over a few hotel receipts. The outburst echoed in the small room. John seemed startled by his own loss of control. He took a deep breath, trying to reclaim his pastoral demeanor, but the damage was done. Suarez could see the real man emerging from behind the carefully constructed facade. She would have told everyone, he continued, his voice quieter but intense. The congregation, the church board, Melissa, do you know what that would have done? How many lives it would have destroyed? So you destroyed Diane's instead. I tried to reason with her. John's shoulders sagged, the weight of his actions finally seeming to hit him. She wouldn't listen. Kept saying she was going to call her sister, expose me to the church. I just wanted her to stop talking, to give me time to figure things out. As John spoke, Suarez thought about the evidence they'd found in the bedroom, the signs of Diane's desperate struggle, the shattered photos, the final unanswered call for help. How long did it take? She asked quietly. How long did you hold on while she fought for her life? John looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. It happened so fast. 1 minute we were arguing, and then… He trailed off, lost in the memory. Her eyes. I'll never forget her eyes when she realized I wasn't going to let go. The confession spilled out over the next 2 hours. John described how he'd first met Melissa during an actual church conference in Orlando. How one lie had led to another, until he found himself living 2 complete lives. He talked about the elaborate systems he developed to keep his world separate, different clothes, different phones, even different ways of speaking and moving. The money was the hardest part, he admitted. Keeping both households running, maintaining appearances. The church books were easy to manipulate. Who questions a pastor about financial details? But it was never enough. There were always more expenses, more lies to cover the old lies. When Suarez asked about the night Diane died, John's clinical detachment was chilling. He described the murder like he was recounting a minor car accident, technical details without emotion. Only when he spoke about being caught at the checkpoint did real feeling creep into his voice. Not remorse for killing his wife, but frustration at his plan falling apart. I had it all worked out, he said, almost to himself. There's a place, out past the state park. Nobody would have found her for months. By then, I would have moved the Orlando family here, played the grieving widower, merged my 2 lives into one. It could have worked. The sun was setting by the time Suarez finished taking his statement. As she gathered her files, John spoke one last time, his voice carrying the same smooth, reasonable tone he'd used to counsel troubled couples. Detective, he said, I don't suppose there's any way to keep this quiet? For the sake of the children. Both families have been through enough already. Suarez looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the respected pastor or the family man, but the calculator behind both masks. You've done enough, she said finally. It's time for the truth to have its day. As she left the interrogation room, she could hear him beginning to pray, his voice carrying the same practiced cadence he'd used every Sunday. But now, the words rang hollow, empty of everything except the echo of a life built on lies. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse buzzed with tension on the first day of John Matthews' trial. Linda Reynolds sat in the front row, her back straight and eyes forward, determined to witness every moment of the proceedings. Behind her, the wooden benches filled with church members, reporters, and curious onlookers, all straining to catch their first glimpse of the fallen pastor. When they brought John in, he wore an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual suit and collar. The months in custody had changed him. His carefully maintained hair had grown out, showing more gray than black now. But he still carried himself with the same measured control, nodding respectfully to the judge as if he were about to deliver a sermon rather than face murder charges. The prosecution's opening statement painted a devastating picture. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen stood before the jury, her voice clear and unwavering. This case is about more than just murder, she began. It's about a man who spent years crafting an elaborate deception, who preached about honesty while living a lie, and who, when finally exposed, chose to kill rather than face the consequences of his actions. Security footage from the checkpoint played on screens around the courtroom. The images were grainy but clear enough. John's car pulling up, his practiced smile failing as the officer noticed the blood seeping from his trunk. Linda watched the footage through tears, knowing her sister's body lay just feet away from where the camera had captured John's final moments of freedom. The medical examiner's testimony was clinical but devastating. Dr. Rodriguez detailed each injury Diane had suffered in her final struggle: defensive wounds on her arms, bruises from being slammed against the wall, the distinctive marks on her throat. She fought hard, he concluded, pointing to photos that made several jurors look away. This was not a quick or merciful death. Financial experts traced the complex web of John's deception through years of bank records. They showed how he'd systematically stolen from the church, laundering money through fake accounts to support his second family. The amounts grew larger over time, small discrepancies in the early years becoming bold transfers as his confidence grew. The church treasurer broke down on the stand, describing how John had manipulated the books. He knew exactly when to move the money, she testified. Always after Big F. Fundraisers or during busy seasons when no one had time to check the accounts carefully. He used our trust in him as a weapon. Detective Suarez's testimony about the interrogation held the courtroom spellbound. She recounted John's transformation from confident spiritual leader to confessed killer, reading excerpts from his confession that revealed the calculating nature behind his seemingly spontaneous crime. Throughout it all, John sat perfectly still, his expression neutral. Only those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of tension, the slightly too rigid posture, the occasional tightening of his jaw. He watched each witness with the same attentive expression he'd once used during confession, as if their testimony was just another sin he was called to absolve. The defense tried to paint John's actions as a crime of passion, arguing that the stress of maintaining his double life had led to a mental breakdown. Their psychological expert testified about the toll of living with constant deception, suggesting that John had lost touch with reality in his final confrontation with Diane. But the evidence told a different story. The prosecution methodically demonstrated how John had prepared for discovery, maintaining secret bank accounts and researching remote locations where a body might never be found. They showed the jury his internet search history from the weeks before Diane's death: untraceable poisons, accidents that look natural, dissolving organic matter. When Melissa took the stand, John showed the first real emotion of the trial. His carefully maintained composure cracked as she described how he deceived her, tears running down her face as she explained to the jury how she'd learned the truth about her life. He was there for every birthday, she testified, her voice breaking. He helped with homework, coached soccer games. How do you fake that kind of love? How do you look your children in the eye and live such a lie? Linda's testimony came near the end of the trial. She carried Diane's journal to the stand, her hands shaking as she opened it. "My sister knew something was wrong," she told the jury. She was gathering evidence, trying to understand what was happening to her marriage. The last entry. She paused, gathering strength. The last entry says she was planning to confront him. She wrote that she wasn't afraid because John would never hurt me. That was the day she died. The defense's cross-examination was aggressive, suggesting that Diane had threatened John, that she'd planned to destroy his life out of revenge. Linda remained calm, her voice steady as she responded. The only thing Diane ever threatened was to tell the truth. If that would destroy John's life, then he destroyed it himself with his lies. When John finally took the stand in his own defense, he spoke with the same compelling charisma that had drawn people to his sermons. He expressed remorse, claiming he'd never meant to hurt anyone. "I loved both my families," he insisted. "Everything I did was to protect them, to provide for them." But under cross-examination, his careful narrative began to unravel. The prosecutor pressed him on specific lies, specific choices, specific moments when he'd chosen deception over truth. With each question, the mask slipped further, revealing glimpses of the calculating man beneath. "Did you love Diane when you wrapped your hands around her throat?" the prosecutor asked finally. "Did you love her when you stuffed her body in your trunk? When you drove around for hours, looking for a place to hide what you'd done?" John's response was chilling in its honesty. "I loved the life I'd built, he said quietly. "I would have done anything to protect it." The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. When the forewoman stood to read it, Linda gripped her sister's journal tightly. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom, and for the first time since his arrest, John's composure completely cracked. He slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally seeming to hit him as the judge prepared to announce his sentence. The sentencing hearing fell on what would have been John and Diane's 21st wedding anniversary. The timing wasn't lost on anyone in the packed courtroom, least of all Linda, who wore her sister's favorite scarf as she prepared to deliver her victim impact statement. Judge Marion Harris's courtroom had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the tension today was different. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, church members, Orlando neighbors, reporters, and curious members of the public, all drawn to witness the final chapter of a story that had captivated Miami for months. John sat at the defense table, wearing a suit again instead of his prison jumpsuit. His attorney had fought for this small dignity, arguing that it would show respect for the court. But the suit hung loose on his frame now. 6 months in county jail had worn away his well-fed pastor's physique, leaving him looking older and somehow smaller. The prosecution went first, summarizing the case that had led to John's conviction. Ada Chen's voice carried through the hushed courtroom as she detailed the calculated nature of his crimes, not just the murder, but the years of systematic deception that led to it. "Your Honor," Chen concluded, "this is not simply a case of a man who lost control in a moment of passion. John Matthews maintained 2 separate lives for years, stealing from his congregation to fund his deception. When faced with exposure, he chose murder over truth. The state recommends the maximum sentence, life, without the possibility of parole." The defense presented character witnesses, former parishioners who spoke about marriages John had saved, teenagers he'd counseled through difficult times, families he'd supported through grief. But their praise rang hollow now, tainted by the knowledge of his double life. Then, it was time for the victim impact statements. Linda approached the podium first, her hands steady as she unfolded her prepared remarks. She looked directly at John as she spoke, forcing him to meet her gaze. "My sister trusted you," she began, her voice clear and strong. "She believed in you. Even at the end, when she found evidence of your lies, she confronted you openly because she couldn't imagine you would actually hurt her. That trust was just one more weapon you used against her." Linda described the void Diane's death had left. Empty chairs at family gatherings, unopened birthday gifts she'd bought months in advance, a garden full of plants that would never see another spring. "You didn't just kill my sister," she told John. "You killed part of everyone who loved her." Melissa spoke next, her testimony carrying the unique weight of someone who had both loved and been deceived by John. She'd brought no prepared statement, choosing instead to speak from her heart. "My children ask about their father every day," she said, her voice catching. "How do I explain to them that the man who tucked them in at night, who kissed their scrapes and celebrated their victories, was living a lie? That while he was playing catch with our son, another family was waiting for him to come home?" When John finally rose to speak, the courtroom fell so quiet you could hear the ceiling fans whirring overhead. He'd spent weeks preparing the statement with his lawyers, knowing it was his last chance to influence his sentence. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice carrying that familiar pastoral cadence, "not to make excuses for my actions, but to express my deep remorse for the pain I've caused." But Judge Harris cut him off. "Mr. Matthews," she said sharply, "save your sermon for someone who hasn't spent 6 weeks watching you manipulate and deceive. This court is interested in truth, not performance." Something shifted in John's face, a crack in the mask he'd worn for so long. For the first time, raw emotion bled through his careful facade. "You want the truth?" His voice rose, losing its practiced smoothness. "The truth is I love them both. I built 2 beautiful lives, provided for 2 families, helped hundreds of people through my ministry. Yes, I lied. Yes, I stole. And yes, when Diane threatened to destroy everything I'd built, I killed her. But don't sit there in judgment of me unless you know what it's like to be needed, truly needed, by so many people." The outburst sent murmurs through the courtroom. Judge Harris's gavel cracked sharply, restoring order. She looked down at John, her expression stern. "Mr. Matthews, in my 20 years on the bench, I've seen many criminals attempt to justify their actions. But few have shown your level of narcissism and self-deception. You speak of being needed? The only person you truly served was yourself." She lifted a folder from her desk, Diane's journal, submitted as evidence during the trial. "I've read every word your wife wrote in the months before her death." She documented her growing suspicions with remarkable clarity, even as she fought to maintain her faith in you. Her last entry shows a woman preparing herself to face a difficult truth, never imagining it would cost her life. The judge's voice hardened. "You used your position as a spiritual leader to manipulate and deceive. You stole from those who trusted you to fund your elaborate deception. And when faced with the consequences of your actions, you chose murder over accountability." John tried to interrupt, but Judge Harris silenced him with a look. "The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to the church for the stolen funds and to both families for damages." As the sentence was pronounced, different reactions rippled through the courtroom. Linda closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. Melissa hugged herself tightly. Church members who'd once hung on John's every word now turned away, unable to look at him. The bailiffs approached to lead John away. For a moment, he resisted, turning to face the courtroom one last time. The mask was completely gone now, revealing a desperate, angry man who had finally run out of lies. "None of you understand," he shouted as they led him toward the door. "Everything I did out of love." "No, John." Linda's voice cut through his protests, quiet but clear. "Everything you did out of pride. And Diane paid the price." The heavy doors closed behind him, and the courtroom slowly emptied. Outside, reporters rushed to file their stories about the fallen pastor's final confrontation with justice. But inside, in the quiet of the nearly empty courtroom, Linda and Melissa sat together, two women united by tragedy, beginning the long process of rebuilding lives shattered by one man's lies. Hope Community Church stood empty for 3 months after John's sentencing. The congregation, fractured by betrayal, couldn't bear to gather in the same space where their former pastor had preached about honesty while living a lie. Dust gathered on the pews, and the garden Diane had tended withered in the Miami heat. Some members drifted to other churches. Others stopped attending services altogether, their faith shaken not just in John, but in the entire concept of religious leadership. The church board met weekly in members' homes, struggling to find a way forward. "We need to reclaim this space," Deacon Sarah Martinez said during one such meeting. "Not for John's memory, but for Diane's. For everyone who found real community here, despite his deception." The healing began slowly. Church members gathered one Saturday to clean the building, working together to erase the physical traces of John's presence. They repainted his office, replaced the pulpit where he'd stood, and replanted Diane's garden with fresh flowers. Linda found unexpected purpose in the aftermath. She channeled her grief into creating the Diane Matthews Foundation, focusing on supporting victims of domestic violence and helping organizations spot signs of financial fraud. The foundation's first workshop was held in the renovated church basement, turning a space once used for John's deception into a center for healing and prevention. Diane always wanted to help people, Linda told the gathered crowd. She believed in seeing the best in others. "We honor her memory not by becoming cynical, but by becoming wiser, learning to balance trust with awareness." The foundation's work quickly expanded beyond Miami. Linda traveled to churches and community organizations across Florida, sharing Diane's story and teaching leaders how to recognize warning signs they might have missed. Each presentation ended with a photo of Diane's garden in full bloom, a symbol of growth from tragedy. Melissa faced her own challenges in Orlando. The community that had known her family as the Matthews now knew them as victims of John's deception. She sold the house, unable to live with the memories it contained, and moved closer to her parents for support. Her children struggled to adjust. David, now 11, refused to talk about his father, channeling his anger into sports and schoolwork. 7-year-old Sarah kept drawing pictures of their family as it had been, asking when Daddy would come home from his long trip. He was real to them, Melissa explained during a support group session. Everything he did with them, the games, the homework help, the bedtime stories, that was real. How do I help them understand that the father they loved never really existed? The support group became a lifeline for families affected by similar betrayals. They shared stories of rebuilding trust, of explaining complex truths to children, of learning to move forward without letting fear of deception poison future relationships. 1 year after the sentencing, Hope Community Church reopened its doors under new leadership. Pastor Rachel Torres, a grief counselor turned minister, approached her role with transparent humility. Her first sermon acknowledged the wounds the congregation carried. "We're not here to forget," she told the half-filled pews. "We're here to remember that faith survives betrayal, that community endures beyond any single leader, and that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than deception." The church established new financial protocols, with multiple people reviewing every transaction. They created support groups for members still processing their complex feelings about John's betrayal. Slowly, the congregation began to heal. Linda and Melissa met monthly, their shared experience forging an unlikely friendship. They worked together on the foundation, using their different perspectives to help others spot the warning signs they'd missed. "I used to hate the woman John left us for," Linda admitted during one of their conversations. "Now I realize you were as much a victim as Diane. He stole years from all of us." The children showed signs of healing too. David joined a youth basketball league, finding positive male role models in his coaches. Sarah started therapy, learning to express her confusion and grief through art. Their drawings and sports trophies filled their new home, creating fresh memories to replace the tainted ones. John's case became a landmark in discussions about domestic violence and religious authority. Law schools used it to study how spiritual leaders could exploit their positions of trust. Churches across the country reviewed their oversight procedures, implementing safeguards against similar deceptions. The media's interest eventually faded, but the impact rippled outward. Other victims of double lives came forward, finding support and understanding in the networks Linda and Melissa had helped build. The foundation's resources helped numerous families navigate their own journeys from betrayal to recovery. Hope Community Church's garden bloomed again, tended now by a group of volunteers who gathered weekly to maintain Diane's legacy. They added a small memorial bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of Diane Matthews, truth grows in love's garden." Linda visited the garden on quiet mornings, finding peace among the plants her sister had loved. Sometimes she imagined Diane there, not as she was in her final moments of fear and betrayal, but as she had lived, kind, trusting, always looking for the best in others. "We're wiser now," Linda whispered to her sister's memory, "but not harder. You taught us that trust is still worth the risk, even if we have to be more careful about how we give it." The story of John Matthews and his double life became more than a tragic headline. It transformed into a catalyst for change, a reminder that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals, and that truth, though sometimes painful, lights the path forward. In Miami and Orlando, in churches and homes, in the lives touched by John's deception and Diane's death, people learned to trust again, not blindly, as before, but with wisdom born of experience. They carried the scars of betrayal, but refused to let them define their futures. And in her garden, season after season, Diane's flowers continued to bloom, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the possibility of new growth from broken ground.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.